Stone holds the day's warmth longer than flesh. In the far north, where breath met air and turned to pale mist, the boy who would become Eddard Stark learned that simple truth by leaning his back against the baked sun face of Winterfell's outer wall until twilight made it cold again. He learned the language of hoarfrost on railing, and that the ravens sang different messages depending on wind and hunger. In the quiet places, the gods wood with its heart tree white as bone and its red leaves whispering. He found a stillness he would carry like a talisman all his life. He grew under the watch of old banners and older words, the child of a house that measured time by seasons rather than days. A second son who listened more than he spoke, who watched carefully and kept what he saw. His father was Rickard Stark, austere and gentle as the winter sun is to a field, distant yet constant, and his mother a memory dim and tender, gone before the boy could make of her more than scent and lullaby. There was an older brother, wild and laughing and quick to draw steel in practice or to chase joy on the training grounds, and a sister with a will like a river in flood, and a younger brother who loved the chill air as much as a hawk loves the updraft. The keep was ironclad in habit. The cook's fire caught at the same hour, the armsmaster's call, the maester's bell, the stable's hayloft dust settling through late shafts of light. The cadence of Winterfell joined itself to the cadence of the boy's heart, and the heart to the stone, and the stone to the soil root deep in the north. When he went south to be fostered at the mountain eyrie of an old lord whose honor was its own climate, he carried that north within him like banked coals. The eyrie was another sort of fortress. Bright air and cliffside paths, banners snapping over bottomless blue, cranes flying at a height that made their shadows small. There he made a brother out of a friend, a storm-blooded air with laughter as vast as summer, and found in their host a slender reed of a man whose strength lay in quiet balances and exacting mercy. Boys, then, but already the road beneath them sloped toward a future written in iron. The world turned on a decision far away, on a king caught in his fear and a prince caught in a charm and a maid caught between them. Fire consumed silk and oath and the dry sweet hay of the royal stables. Shrieks scattered across a city with a name that tasted of dust. The boy Eddard became a man with the gift of grief, a father and a brother taken by decree not of storms but of fire, a family broken on the whim of a throne. The north looked to Winterfell for answer, and the answer rode on cold hooves, banners unfurling like spears of smoke. To the eyrie, ravens flew like dark thoughts. The old lord weighed a king's madness against a promise to two fostered sons and chose the promise. What followed passed into tavern tale and court whisper. The stirring of houses, the sending of letters, a river of men crossing fields that would not forget their tread. In war, Eddard Stark moved as he had always moved. Steady, considered, rare to speak in boast or anger, a sword where duty required and a shield where duty demanded. Battles sang their fierce songs elsewhere, the crashing, flashy choruses of the loud and the renowned. But the work of holding lines, of keeping supply, of turning a camp into a winter-ready encampment when the nights cut like knives, he did that work with an attention that made other men's lives longer. The Riverlands learned the feel of mailed boots. A prince met his doom by the river where reeds drink blood without remark, and bells tolled in a city behind high walls until the bells themselves grew hoarse. A storm friend lifted a hammer in triumph and woke to find triumph uneasy company. When Eddard Stark came at last to the city of red stone and incense, he found the streets streaked with the aftermath of victory's ugliest price. The gates were open. The banners of a great western house had arrived before him like a wolf to a henhouse, and the battle had ended with infants silenced by men who liked to call their work prudent. He stood in that heat with the smell of crushed myrtle in the courtyards and old blood turning black and told his friend the storm-born king what he thought of such prudence. Though they loved each other, the words between them lay heavy. Argument cast shade over friendship. Eddard withdrew, as a wounded animal might retire into thicket, taking his own men and his own honor and going south and south again until roads ended and mountains opened like a secret mouth. There is a tower in a dry land where the silence hums. There the last knights of a fallen dynasty stood in white, resolute as statues, their vows more enduring than the house they served. Eddard came with few companions, plain men, loyal men, and fought not for plunder or rank but for blood's sake and love's sake and the ache that had driven him day and night across a continent. Steel answered steel. Sand drank shadow and men fell, and the day, which had begun sharp and bright, softened toward something gray and endless. He climbed broken stairs and entered a room where the smell of crushed flowers could not hide the smell of sweat and fear, where a sister he had known as a storm of laughter lay abed with the last of her strength. She asked him for a thing no brother would want to give, and yet many brothers would, if they had the courage to put duty above their own desire for the clear, clean lines of honor. He made a promise. He took a child into his arms and into his name and into the frost-strong fortress of the north, and he would let the world think of it what it liked, would bear the looks and whispers, would carry the quiet injury that such a choice lays on a marriage. He had seen how princes die and how children die. He had learned what safety is worth. Back at Winterfell, he set down the sword and shouldered the mantle and the STO. Eni held him up as it had when he was a boy. He married a river lady who had been meant for his brother, and together they built a house around themselves as one builds a fire. Carefully, with patience, with regard for spark and ember. Her voice filled the galleries. Her hands smoothed linens and settled quarrels and guided small fingers into sewing, into letters, into prayers. They had children who grew as quickly as summer grass. A son with his grandfather's steadiness, a daughter who watched courtiers' faces as if reading, another daughter whose feet were forever scuffed from running and whose hair could never be persuaded to stay, a boy who climbed walls and loved stories of knights, another boy who chewed on his nurse's braid and found his mother's brooch irresistible. There was also the child from the tower, dark and quiet, solitary and fierce in his love, who watched from the half-lit places and learned the North's blunt grammar as if it were the only tongue in the world. Years passed and the land coiled into its long, patient waiting. Summer bled away in slow degrees. Eddard Stark taught his sons how to hold a blade without fear and his daughters how to move through the world without flinching. He stood in the Godswood and let the old tree's red eyes regard him while he remembered faces he could never see again. He walked the walls and counted the watchfires and knew by the feel of the wind when snow would come a day early. He was not a man to speak his own virtues. He simply did what lay before him. When a deserter was taken in the fields, ragged, eyes full of something wild and cold, Eddard faced him in the pale daylight with his greatsword in both hands and the air around them so clear it hurt to draw breath, and he made of duty a clean cut. Wordless instruction is the best kind. His sons watched. The little ones slept in their furs that night as if a ritual had been completed. That winter the wolves returned. Not as men's wounds and banners in the dark, but as the Old North understands wolves, in track and scent and wonder. The stag's broken antler and the she-wolf dead on the riverside and the pups, eyes still closed, belly warm and mewling, offered a kind of sign that can make even the most practical man think twice about what he dismisses as omen. Eddard relented where he might have been strict, and each child took into their care a piece of the forest that would shape them in ways no tutor could. Then the South came north again, this time armored in velvet and merriment. Wheels of gilded wagons creaked through Winterfell's yards, and the smell of spiced boar and crushed roses drifted into the kitchens. A king he had loved like a brother dismounted on tired knees, crying out for wine and jests, hungry for something honest. He embraced Eddard and made of the memory of drums and banners a simpler thing between men. He wanted Eddard at his side again, not as friend but as hand to steady his own. An old steward watching from the steps understood at once what was being asked, long before the letters were written and the seals pressed. Eddard did not love the South. It was full of heat and latticed words and slippery courtesies. He loved Winterfell and the way the light fell on its stones in the brief summer twilight, the smell of the pines near the outer brook, the sound the ravens made when snow loaded the roofs. Yet duty called like a bell whose sound will not be shut out, and his love reminded him that sometimes the honest thing is to leave what you cherish to store up honor in a place that needs it. He forbade his love to be commanded by drifting rumor, or to let fear bargain with truth, and he set his household in order. The boy who climbed fell instead and lay between seasons, breathing in one world and listening in another. While his household trembled with the shock of it, the Lord of the North laced himself into southern duties and rode out under a sky full of change, with his daughters flanking him on the road, the older ones' thoughts like lace and the younger ones like wind. On that long road south, Eddard Stark parted with the boy who had never known his mother, the boy from the desert tower who had his aunt's eyes and his father's restraint. The child had asked for the wall, the long black line at the world's top where snows stack and men thin out for the sake of something profound and wordless. Eddard embraced him as calmly as he could, the gods would, and a different promise nodding in his chest. They spoke as fathers and sons do when they fear the next words might be the last for a long while. Plainly, awkwardly, bravely. The boy rode north into a saga older than the first houses carved from timber, and Eddard turned his face towards stone that glowed in the sun like a promise and bit like a viper in the shade. The city of the south greeted him with perfume and lies and more banners than a plane can count. The courtiers were restless birds, the spies were gardeners who tended a vine of secrets, and the throne itself was made of other men's griefs hammered into something that cut whoever sat it. His friend the king laughed, hunted, swore, and drank, and beneath it the ground opened into fissures of old debts and new loves. There was a queen whose smile covered sharp edges and golden children, whose faces did not quite mirror the man who called them his own. There were brothers, the short one with jokes to hide wounds and the golden one with a knight's grace that hid something harder. And there was a man from Eddard's youth who spoke with a poor boy's hunger through a lord's lips. There was a spider who walked the web of the city and never ceased to taste the tremor of every footfall. The hand's chair did not fit his shoulders. He investigated where the city's streams ran dark. A dead predecessor and the trail of his curiosity, records and apprenticeships, bastards tucked into corners of the city like seeds hidden in walls, a book of lineages dry as straw yet full of spark. He visited a smith whose hammer had sung a song that once echoed through his friend's youth. He spoke to a boy with hair like coal and eyes that matched and saw in the boy's face a pattern the book had laid out in tidy columns. He followed that logic toward a truth that made the air in his lungs go thin. He confronted a queen in the soft green depth of a garden where perfumed bees moved lazily from bloom to bloom, and he told her the thing he had learned, not with a Southron threat but with a Northman's stark candor. She answered in kind, her words like silk over glass, and they parted as adversaries who might in another world have admired one another for being so perfectly themselves. The city tightened around him. A letter came, borne by a bird whose wings beat between storms, and the words in that letter turned the day into a different substance. He urged the king to caution he would not heed. There was a tourney where the crowds shouted and the lists shone, where a knight all in blue roses haunted the memory of a younger man who had watched his sister crown another. There was a skirmish in an alley that left him with a wound and a slower gait, and the lion banners of the west snapped with new fervor in the riverlands as if to tell the north, you will be drawn into what is coming. He sent a lord with a red banner against the men who hunted peasants for sport, and the river itself watched the old balances totter. Between the clatter and the whispers, between the ink-stained fingers of the book and the blood on cobbles, Eddard Stark walked a line as narrow as the edge of a sword. Fruit ripens, falls, bruises, and must be eaten at once or wasted. The king he loved was wounded by his own appetites, a boar's tusk and a careless cup conspiring in a hunt that turned to a bier, candles guttered by a bed where a man's laughter had lived. Into that chamber Eddard Stark brought parchment meant to hold the realm together while grief made all men foolish. He wrote a name that meant sovereignty without cruelty and placed his hope on men whose loyalty could be bought with truth. He trusted an old colleague who had grown up from hunger into something sly, and that trust was a rope he did not test before he leaned his weight upon it. When the bell tolled and the court gathered beneath the harsh shine of the throne, Eddard believed the city might choose peace. Instead, he learned again what it is to watch an ally turn, and the copper stink of betrayal rose like a sudden fog. Swords he thought he commanded turned points toward him. The lion's children were brought forward, and a boy proclaimed himself king with a voice still tender from youth. Eddard's choices collapsed as if cut. His household bled on the steps. He was led away not like a lord to parley, but like a thief to a cell where no light came but what could not be refused. In the dark, he fostered memories the way other men foster sons. He held in his mind the heavy shape of the weirwood's trunk, the way snow skinned the pond, the sound his daughter's laugh made when it slipped out unplanned, the feel of the greatsword's leather wrappings when his hand had been young and sure. He learned the guard step, the length of time between water and bread, the exact shape of despair when it sits down and makes itself at home. A man without light teaches himself to read by the temperature of the air and the scrape of a bowl and the change in a jailer's voice when a girl child has been sent to beg for mercy. In that darkness came a whisperer in silk who spoke as if he had always been his friend, promising outcomes that would at least place his daughters beneath a roof rather than beneath a stone. Eddard had always preferred the straight road. He found himself on a twist that saved nothing but time. They brought him out at last into stinging white daylight and the great square where saints looked down, serene and unhelpful. The crowd had gathered with that mix of hunger and hope that cities breed, faces upturned like flowers to rain. On a platform stood a boy wearing a crown and the boy's mother with a gaze made of winter sunlight and the boy's uncles like pillars flanking a gate no living man could open. His elder daughter was there with her hands folded and her knuckles pressed white by their own pressure. And his younger daughter was somewhere in that press of bodies with her hair tied back and a thin blade hidden like a bad thought. Eddard Stark looked at the boy, at all the ruthlessness and fear tangled in that youth, and he found that he could not hate him as he might have hated a man. The world had shaped them both, and some shapes are hard to undo. He spoke the words they wanted, not because they were true but because saying them might return one child to a safer bed. He made himself small as a man like him can make himself, which is to say, he made his pride yield where his honor refused. The sun burned, the air glittered with dust. He thought of the red leaves and the cold that saved your breath for you. The moment stretched to long thread, and just as he began to believe the thread would hold, the boy who wore the crown tugged sharply. Steel moved. The headsman stepped into a place prefigured by blood and law, and the old sword that had once rested in Eddard's own hall flashed in a circle that the eye could not look at without shame. A hush fell that no bell could break. They carried him away from his life on a wooden bier that made as little complaint as he had. The city returned to its business, which is to say it magnified itself in rumor and hungers and plots. In the room where the queen had smiled, men bargained for the sword that had held the North's winters in its dark waves. In the rooms where the hand had written and sealed and hoped, rats searched for crumbs and found only candle stubs. The pieces of him that could return north traveled slowly, halting at River and Holdfast, accompanied by men who had known him as Boy and M. N and Father, who could not say with their mouths what their hands did by continuing to carry the bier. Somewhere then and soon after, the sword that had sung for centuries over birch and bog was fed a fire so hot it forgot its own name, and its two children went out into a world that would use their bright edges against not only foes but kin. Far north of the city, the world rearranged itself to account for a hole a man had left. A son with his father's quiet gathered banners and men whose voices cracked when they shouted for war, and together they marched into a story larger than they were ready to hold. Lords knelt with reluctance and with joy and found in kneeling that they had risen again into something older than titles. A woman of the Riverlands with grief like a veil moved through camps and corridors looking for a point upon which to fix her sorrow, and finding none she made points for herself with wit and anger and the steady hands of a mother. A girl who had been promised silk learned the feel of wool and the geometry of survival inside a palace designed to crush the honest. Another girl learned to move like a shadow and to answer cruelty with ice. The boy who had gone to the Black Wall raised his head into weather that bit through skin to bone and discovered a world stranger than bedtime tales. A world where old things woke and remembered names they had not spoken in 1,000 years. In the halls of the North, the women hung new tapestries and the men mended pikes, and the raven's wings sounded like pages turning. The gods would took the news the way trees always do, silently, with a motion too slow for eyes. The crypts, where stone lords and ladies wait patient as snowdrifts, received another burden whose name would be carved in time. The wolves grew, each according to its own law, their eyes bright and their loyalties absolute, their paths diverging as the children's did. It is a curious thing, how a life continues after its end. Eddard Stark's decisions seeded themselves far and wide. Men who had fought beside him made choices in his memory, for good and ill. Men who had fought against him recalled his steadiness and wondered to themselves what it might be like to wake one morning with that sort of rest in one's heart. His name, spoken in the north, tasted of hard water and hearth smoke, of the clean iron tang of the smithy and the soft musk of horse. Spoken in the south, it tasted of mixed wine and danger, of a candle snuffed quickly and a document hidden under another document for safety. Children formed their idea of honor around his absence the way young trees grow toward a gap of light in the forest. For some, that honor meant mercy. For others, it meant blade. Years bent at their knees. War remade maps only for the old shapes to reassert themselves like frost patterns on glass. The riverlands boiled. The west sharpened its teeth. The vale folded into itself like an injured bird. The dead began to move in the far north where the shoulder of the world sags beneath the sky, and stories returned with the breath of travelers who had seen more night than they were meant to. The boy who had taken the black climbed higher in duty, and far away, on a continent where the sun turned blood to incense, a young woman learned her own hard lessons. Strands crossed and knotted. Mothers and daughters, brothers and wards, lovers and enemies. All found the shape of their days altered by a man who was not there to speak or lift a brow or put a gentle hand on a shoulder. Of the promise he had kept for his sister, there were days when silence was the only guard that would do. He had let his good wife believe what wives in great houses often must, because a marriage is also a fortress and sometimes the gate must be barred for reasons even the lady of the place will not learn. In keeping that promise, Eddard Stark became a kind of tree, rooted and patient, a refuge and a secret. The boy he sheltered grew into a man who would stand where the cold was loudest and look into it without fear. If the price of that had been whispers in halls and a shadow on the marriage bed, then that was the price. Some debts you pay in coin, some you pay in time, some you pay with your name. In the city where he died, the men who had worn lions on their chests melted down the North's old steel and gave it different names, and those names carried a sinister gleam in lamplight. It takes more than fire to turn winter into summer. It takes more than renaming to erase a song from metal. Steel remembers, so do stones, so do daughters, so do sons. If a sword can carry forward what a man believed, then the North's old blade carried forward not only edge but principle, even when turned toward purposes alien to its first forging. In time that too would be judged by hands that shook less than the hands that lifted the hammers then. Eddard Stark's daughters learned the world in very different schools. One bent her neck and discovered there is more iron in manners than in armor. She watched and listened and survived the galling sweetness of pretty rooms, learning what power hides inside powerlessness. The other learned names that men think a child cannot hold in her mouth and turned herself into a very small and very keen instrument. Both of them kept, in strange ways and far places, the memory of a father whose idea of justice was a long, steady look and the weight of a sword that did not quiver. In the flicker of lamplight on a quart goblet, in the reflection of a canal filled with sky, each sometimes saw his face and maybe nodded to it as one nods to a ghost that means no harm. His oldest son met the world head-on and found that the world does not yield to honor without price. He won beautiful victories that fed campfires and songs and woke the old gods in their trees, and he entered a hall thinking justice would carry him through and discovered instead the deep, treacherous pools that love and oath dig in the same flow. Or, he fell as a young oak falls, loudly, and the birds in the canopy flew terrified, and afterward the forest was different. Men who had knelt to him said his father's name again, low and grieving, and swore that they had meant it. Back at the black wall, the boy who had hugged his father in the winter yard led men into the white waste and returned with the knowledge that sometimes the dead remain dead and sometimes they do not, and that a kingdom can be lost one shivering night at a time. His choices carried the same flavor his father's had, the slow, bitter strength of doing what is right even when it chafes those who wanted something more theatrical. He stood where bitter wind tears at the eyes and saw, in some wordless way, the pattern of the game he had never asked to play. Some would say that Eddard Stark lost because he died. But there are other measures. A man who teaches a son that a sentence should be carried out by the mouth that pronounces it has given the boy a rule that will save strangers' lives as surely as it will cost him friends. A man who keeps a promise to a dying girl, even when the cost is the soft part of a marriage and the sharp parts of his reputation, has planted in the world a tree that will one day shade children who never knew his name. A man who insists on telling the truth to a queen holding a city like a delicate poison does not merely seal his own doom. He shines a small, distant light that someone far away may follow. If he errs, as all men do, he errs toward decency. He chooses wrong allies not because he is foolish, but because he believes there is value in trusting. In a tale told to send listeners gently toward sleep, the point is not that the good are always spared. The point is that the good make a specific weather through which even evil must travel. When the news of his death came to the north, the kitchens went quiet in ways that only kitchen women notice. Even the steam seemed subdued. Men who sharpened blades paused with whetstones in the air. Snow fell the next day, though it had not been forecast by the sky. The weirwood did not change. Trees do not. But among its roots a child sat with her knees to her chest and did not cry. And later that night a wolf howled in a timbered court, and the men who heard it told themselves it was only some far pack on the move. In the crypt, a new figure stood between old ones, and the craftsman with his chisel felt that he was carving not only a face but a sort of instruction. Later still, when other kings wore other crowns and the land's quarrels became a kind of long winter that no calendar could measure, Eddard Stark's story shifted into a sort of prayer. Not the kind said aloud in chapels, but the kind a soldier mutters before sleep when he thinks of home. The kind a mother murmurs into the hair of a child who asks whether people come back from where fathers go. The kind a traveler holds underneath his breath when he sees a certain kind of cloud over a certain kind of field and feels an ache where the old words used to live. Even in the city of red stone, where high windows look onto courtyards with orange trees and fountains carved from conquerors' loot, the name of the North's old lord could sometimes be heard spoken softly by men who treasured their own memories of a time when the world looked briefly understandable. And in the high places, where the road tilts and the air thins and a hawk's cry feels like a thread pulled through the chest, the old Foster house remembered a boy who had stood with feet together and hands straight down, listening to instruction, and had nodded once as if to say that he knew the sky is cleanest after snow. The lord who had taught him was gone, and the storm-blooded friend had fallen to his own appetites and a spear, and still the Eyrie was itself, and somewhere there is comfort in that. Rivers keep going. Mountains keep still. Men do their best. The last word belongs, perhaps, to the godswood, not because gods are provable, but because trees hold what men cannot. There the heart tree stands, pale and patient, while seasons circle like hounds around a hare. There the air smells of wet bark and cold iron and the faint sweetness of decay, which is another word for memory. A man once stood there with a sword too large for ceremony and a face too honest for court, and he let the old silence pass through him like weather. He walked away into a life of choices that would end beneath a hot sun and a crowd's murmur, and the tree, which had known how many lives and deaths, added his to the slow red tide that flows within it. If you stand there now, listening with more than ears, you may feel, as dusk settles and an owl glides low, the sense that a certain kind of man has been here and is not gone. The North keeps such things. Stone remembers. Snow remembers. The living do, too, and sometimes the living make of their remembering a bridge the dead can cross with ease. Children sleep better when they are told that the world is full of stories that are bigger than their fear. Eddard Stark's story is one of them. It is the map of a life that hewed to straight lines even when the road moved beneath it. A life that measured success by the warmth of a hall in winter, by the handful of snow that does not fall when men keep their vows, by the small ordinary mercies that make the difference between cruelty as policy and kindness as habit. He died in the sun. He lives where it is cold. In the turning of years, the lesson lasts. Be steady. Keep your word. Do not take what is not yours. Look to your children and to the children you did not know were yours. Do not be tempted by the short road when the long one is right. Men fall, but the things they believed, if believed well enough, continue like the steady drip of water from an eve in spring, wearing a clean path into the stone, an honest line from door to yard, from home to gate, from one life to the next. So when the fire burns low and slee, he comes on soft feet. Imagine the keep where he began, its stones still warm with day. Imagine his hand on the rough bark of the heart tree, his breath a cloud before him that vanishes as breath will. Imagine the wolf track stamped deep and filling with new snow. Somewhere, a bell rings as a dinner is served. Somewhere else, a raven settles its feathers against a coming squall. Between them stands a man like a hinge, joining the north and the south, the old and the new, the living and the dead. He is gone, and yet he remains, a winter star seen through blown clouds, steady as a nail in a beam, steady as a hand on the hilt of a sword that serves not bloodlust but law. Sleep, then, and let his story go on telling itself as stories will, under your breath, under the world's breath, under the patient snow. Night deepens even after you think it has gone as far as it can, deepens until the sky is a velvet pelt and each small sound carries like a dropped pin in a chapel. In that long night, after the city's harsh noon had taken what it took, the north measured time in rushlight and in the soft lift and fall of sleeping children. Firelight on stone made old shadows look like familiar faces seen from the corner of the eye. In their separate beds, the household shifted and settled as houses do when something at their center has been unseated. Wind explored the seam of a shutter. Somewhere in the kennels a dog turned 3 times and folded itself neatly into warmth. In the great hall the embers redrew the hearth's geometry, as if the room itself was teaching its walls new ways to hold the cold back. Beyond the rooms and rugs lay the bones of the keep, and beyond the keep the land, and beneath the land something older that did not speak in words at all. There is a language to stillness. In those days the North practiced it very carefully. Caitlin of the Riverlands moved through that stillness as one moves through a winter orchard, touching the clean bark of trunks as if to steady herself, mind hearing again the voices of children running ahead, laughing, and then not hearing them, only the quiet she made by refusing to give the silence the last word. She had loved a man whose shoulders were built to carry the hard parts and who never put down a burden crooked. She had learned, while he lived, that he made space around himself in which others could breathe. Without him, the air seemed thinner. She would stand sometimes at the parapet when day was a pale coin and watch the breath of the horses in the yard lift like small spirits into the morning. She would remember a boy with strong, shy hands mending a toy for a child who would never think to thank, or a husband's voice by the hearth telling an old tale the clean way. No extra polish, nothing missing, the truth laid flat like a cloak. Grief's first pass is a storm. After that, it is a lake at night, holding the sky with no ripple. Her eldest son set to it with all the earnestness she had seen in him as a boy, how he had always preferred honest work to pretty talk, how his hand had always gone first to the tool and then to the task, how the corridors of the castle had bent themselves around him when he walked as if stone already knew who would keep it warm another generation. He gathered men the way winter gathers clouds. They came for the old words and for the new ones, for a promise they could make with their backs unbent. In each camp his father's name was said softly at first and then more firmly, until the sound of it braided itself into the drumbeat and the creak of leather and the whicker of horses who wanted oats. There were victories that came like cups of hot broth, warming but disappearing too quickly. There were losses that made even the hardiest man take off his glove and put fingers to his eyes as if something stung. Each day in that moving town of men, the boy made small choices that would become his shape in the world. Whose word to take, which letter to answer at once, and which letter to leave unopened until after bread. When he slept, he dreamed of rivers because riverfolk always do. When he woke, he looked north first without meaning to. Honor, in those marches, was a tent peg driven straight into frost-hard ground. To the south and east, where courtyards smelled of crushed herb and roofs shone like arrowheads, the city did what cities always do. It made a great noise to hush itself. It told and retold the moment when the square had swallowed a man and returned him as story. A young queen arranged her days like stones across a stream, stepping with exquisite care from one to the next. A boy who had been made to play at summoning fear learned the true sound of it and enjoyed the difference. A brother who covered old wounds with laughter thought, now and then, of a tall northern man and wished he had insisted harder on taking him by the elbow and leading him to safety. The silk walkers and web-sitters, the sellers of secrets and the buyers of them, all shifted their weight to keep balance on the thin ice that passes for order in such a place. Somewhere, a swordsmith saw his craft in the blade that had ended a man he had respected from a distance and afterward avoided his shop for an entire day, as if steel itself required time to grieve. There are journeys that look, from afar, like lines on a map and journeys that are more like rings in a tree. In the far north, a child who had fallen between seasons woke to the strange intelligence of crows and the patient arithmetic of roots. The woodsman's tales were true in ways his listeners had not understood. The forest does not merely observe. It remembers and it teaches if one learns how to ask. Bran. First a boy lying still and angry at the stillness, later a boy who understood that stillness might be another kind of walking. Found in frost and sap, a conversation so ancient it felt like the world speaking to itself. The white tree in the gods' wood had been whispering all along in a voice made of leaf and light. Now, the boy learned the grammar of that voice and followed it north along old riverbeds of memory to a place where the sky was so clean it hurt to look at it too long and the wind sang under stone. There he was taught to open his eyes in a way that does not require eyelids. He saw his father in other years, moving through Winterfell as he had always moved. A man unhurried not because he was slow but because he had learned what rush wastes. Once, hearing or believing he heard. A call flowed across the years. The man in those remembered days looked up as if a draft had touched his neck, frowning in the way he would when he was counting what he owed and to whom. The boy reached toward that look and felt the world shiver, then let his hand fall. It is a great discipline to keep from pulling at the threads that hold time together. He was always good at discipline, even when he did not care for it. In the river country, a mother's path wandered through halls that had held her childhood, and now held the consequences of choices she had made with her hands tight around the truth. She bargained, and the bargains took parts of her she had not realized were mortgaged. Each bridge across water asked her to pay toll with some scrap of the woman she had been when she laughed in sunlight under willows, and each time she paid, because coin is whatever you keep giving away to honor the place from which you came. The river runs, indifferent to the cups dipped into it. In candlelight her hands shook, once and then did not again. Duty in a mother is not the bright banner it is in a boy. It is thread and needle and a lamp kept trimmed and the stubborn refusal to let despair have the last word at a bedside. She had learned that from the man she loved. That clean stubbornness which requires no oath, only repetition. Winterfell itself learned a new verb, to be emptied. An old friend brought salt and iron with him and poured both into the cracks. And in the days that followed the keep tasted itself made ash. Smoke found old beams that had waited generations to burn and wrote its black script along the sky. Snow fell gray and then white again. Ravens came and went with their unreadable eyes. In the corner of a ruined room a toy horse lost a wheel and slept in ash like a little thing that had outlasted use. The people who had always belonged to the place scattered into the sheltering hills and the little tight valley villages that do not write letters but do keep memories. Like all betrayals, it began not with malice but with a wonky need to prove something to oneself. He who did it, whose voice rose and fell at the wrong times as if he could not hear the music other men heard, found later that there are some houses you cannot occupy without them occupying you. Winterfell is among those. It will make you into its own shape or break you in the attempt. He learned both halves of that lesson. Far south and up, in a house high among sky and rock where birds fly below windows and servants measure whether by rope and pulley, a young woman made out of snow the home of her childhood. She put the towers where they had always belonged and traced with mittened finger the path to the Godswood Pond. She smoothed white roofs with the surety of someone who had walked those roofs in another life. Her aunt watched with the hunger of those who want to preserve something by squeezing it too tight. Snow is a fragile medium for architecture. That day ended as such days do, with the balance upset between joy and control, with structures crushed by the very hands that had made them. The girl learned again a truth she had once known without naming it, that memory is safe only when it is allowed to breathe. She brushed her wet gloves against her skirt and watched the white castle slump and merge back into the drift from which it had risen. And she thought of her father's hand on her hair when she was small and had made of bread dough some misshapen animal. "It does not need to be perfect," he had said in the voice that was both soft and flint. "It needs to be yours." She kept that in the pocket where girls keep things without knowing they will need them later. Across the narrow water on a quay that smelled of fish and tar, a girl listened to a city that never slept sing to itself in a dozen languages about hunger and brass buttons and the price of an onion at dawn. She traded her old name for a blank coin and entered a house whose rooms slid softly into one another like the stages of sleep. Faces hung as quietly there as knives in a butcher's careful rows, each useful, each waiting, each sharpened by ritual. She learned how to hold her breath until her pulse made no ripple on the surface of a bowl. She learned to walk inside another's posture and to read lies in the way shoulders carry their fatigue. At night, in the empty room where no one might see, she sometimes moved as her father had taught her to move, with a small blade and a thoughtfulness that made every gesture its own conclusion. Names were a kind of prayer. She kept speaking them until their edges wore smooth, kept speaking them until some of them were no longer needed, kept the one name she never said as the home inside her no house could grant. If sometimes a winter wind off the water brought to her nose the scent of cold stone, it was only the city echoing something from far away, or else it was only the old gods stretching in their sleep. On the wall, whose stones carry a kind of cold that remembers all the skins it has brushed, a young man who had always been too old for his years learned command the way a greenwood learns fire. Unwillingly at first, then thoroughly, then with the knowledge that what is consumed has become something new. He went out into the world as far as men go and return sane, and he met among free folk a woman who folded him into herself with the frankness of a campfire. In a cave where the world stopped asking and Tart simply allowing, he forgave the part of himself that had always measured and measured before acting, but afterward the measures returned as they must for a man made of his father's habits, and the road bent again toward duty. She said, without rancor, that he knew nothing, and it was true in that moment and not true at all if you looked across all the days that came before and after. He had learned from his father that the right thing done without pride is a quiet kind of strength. He learned now that the right thing done with sorrow is another strength, quieter still. The winds north of the wall do not care whether men grieve, but the men are better for it when they do. When the world's long night pressed itself across the rim of the sky and spread its weight over dale and dun and village and holdfast, it came not like a single blow but like a cold that will not be kept out by any amount of kindling. Doors shuddered, fences rattled, 1,000 little fires burned like constellations fallen to earth. Men who had scoffed at old songs remembered the exact words when saying them felt like keeping a fellow warm. In halls far south, courtiers bartered for candles and pantries. In huts far north, crofters put their last stew to simmer and then forgot to eat, watching the snow fall as if watching a messenger approach. In that dark, many remembered the man who had been most himself in winter and thought he would have known what to say. But what he would have said and what he had always said, they already knew. Gather, do not pretend you can do this alone. Hold fast to the one next to you and let them hold fast to you. His eldest son had found that lesson too late. His daughters found it at the right time. His younger son gave it new meaning by speaking to trees. The boy he had brought home from a promise made it his policy, which is a fine word for something older than words. Steel keeps its own record. The wide dark blade that had hung behind a northern lord's chair for longer than 3 generations had been fed to a southerly fire and given back to the world as 2 bright children in gilded scabbards. One went to a man whose fingers loved the feel of the world's wealth, and with it he believed he had remade a destiny, as people sometimes believe that renaming can change a thing's heart. The other was given into protection and became, under the hand of a tall, plain-faced knight who honored vows beyond any applause, a thing like a candle carried faithfully through storms. In time that blade returned to the north as if answering a call it could not hear but could feel. In the godswood where light drips like cold water from the leaves, that loyal knight stood and made her own sort of prayer, which was to keep watch without rest. The sword in her hand did not sing, but if steel could hum it would have hummed there, holding for a moment a memory of the stone hall where it had once watched seasons pass in patient silence. It is easy to tell ourselves that matter does not remember. Nonetheless, sometimes we touch a thing and feel a thickness in it that can only be the weight of having belonged to something honest. Word travels strangely in a country that has learned to speak mostly with its eyes. In quiet rooms, by lamplight, one truth after another surfaced like trout at evening. There had always been whispers and numberings, lists in a dead man's book and faces that did not match their supposed lines. It is one thing to suspect, another to know, and still another to say aloud in a room where others will hear and not turn away. At last the promise a brother had made in a room that smelled of fear and that faint sweetness which means endings, that promise breathed in the open air. The boy he had carried from heat into cold was made to see himself newly, and others were made to see him as he had always been but in a different light. No curse or blessing rests entirely in what we are called. The meaning is in what we do. But names are also keys, and when the right name fits a lock, the bolt slides back with a particular soft certainty. Among the crypts where stone figures lie with their wolves at their feet, breaths held. A sister carved in the likeness of a girl who died young looked on with the mildness of the long dead. It was not vindication or accusation that moved through those tunnels, but relief. The way a room exhales when a window has finally been opened after a long winter. There was another winter like that, many years ago, in a room where a midwife had closed the shutters against dust and heat as if against the future, and a brother bent close to hear the last small thing a sister had to give him. He did as she asked, because he had always done what he promised, even when it made him the subject of cold jokes in warm halls. He carried the weight that comes of being misunderstood, an oddly sharp, oddly lonesome weight, and did not set it down, trusting that one day the truth would be its own defense. Now and then the world keeps this sort of faith with the faithful, and now and then it does not. In his case it did, in its own slow, oblique way. The boy became a man, and in becoming a man used the shape given him by the lie to do good. And when the lie was no longer needed, it turned over gently and became a truth, which is a kind of alchemy no king ever entirely manages. In rooms of the capital, where summers have a bluish glare and winters feel merely fashionable, people told each other what they had always said about the Northern Lord. That he had been too stiff to bend and so had snapped. That he had been too honest to survive among ornate knives. That he had been a good father and a poor politician. That he would have done better in another age. All these things were both wrong and right in the way verdicts are when handed down by those who watch rather than do. He had lived in his own age and done his work there, which is the only possibility. If sometimes he had seemed obdurate, it was because he took a long time deciding and then committed. If sometimes he had seemed naive, it was because he wanted to believe men could be better than their appetites. If sometimes he had seemed cold, it was because winter teaches a person to hold feelings inside so that other things, bread, banners, courage, can be kept warm. The city suffers a particular allergy to simplicity, but the world north of it applauds a clean ledger and a kept word. His daughters found their way to one another with the amazement that comes when two travelers emerge from different woods and discover they have been walking parallel paths across a whole country. In the yard where their childish quarrels had once spun into laughter or tears, they looked at one another with the eyes of women who had learned to build shelters inside themselves. One had rebuilt herself around manners until the shape fit. The other had chipped herself like flint until she sparked when struck. They moved differently, spoke differently, meant the same thing when they spoke of home. In the godswood they stood beneath the red leaves that looked like hands and listened, not because they expected words, but because that was what their father had taught them to do, to be silent and to let a place tell them what it needed. When they left, each carried something from that silence. One a patience for working in small increments until the world changed without noticing. The other a precision for striking exactly where cruelty balances itself on its narrowest point. Between them, they made a weather a tyrant could not withstand. On the heights and in the deeps, beyond walls and below them, the war that had started as quarrels among kin and pride among old houses widened until it became a kind of season. It swept up kings like leaves. It tossed queens into seas of decision. Men made maps and unmade them and made them again. And yet, through it all, in the north a keep lifted its shoulders to the snow and outlasted another round of fires. Stones blackened, stones were scrubbed, stones were replaced. In kitchens where every woman knows to salt potatoes twice, girls listed mercies on their fingers. The child who came home, the letter that arrived, the wolf that was seen standing at the forest edge as if watching over a field. In the mornings, boys took the stairs two at a time and shouted to one another about nothing in particular, the way boys will in a house that feels safe again. Old men in warm corners told again the story of the Stark who had been too straight for crooked times, and in their telling there was respect without regret, affection without embroidery. A mason with hands as square as bricks would say that the Lord had remembered their names even after time had ground them into mortar. A shepherd would say that he had never taken wool without counting lambs first. A former soldier would tap the rim of his cup and note the exactness with which the man had divided rations before taking his share, never otherwise. They always ended by saying his name and then looking down into their cups. Names are an anchor, and it is a comfort to have one even when you do not need it to fetch you back to shore. It is not only the living who keep a place. The hewn likeness of Eddard Stark in the crypt is less the man than the idea of him laid in stone. And yet there is a way the air changes in those rooms when someone brings a lantern near his statue. The flame steadies. The dust hangs more decorously. Wolves carved at the feet of the old lords seem, for the length of a breath, about to move. On certain days, when a daughter or a son comes to speak quietly to the dead, as if such conversations were not mostly with oneself, there is a listening there that is not entirely imagination. Stone holds heat a long time after a palm leaves it. Vows too. A person presses their hand to the calm, cold knee of a statue and remembers a living man's knee as he knelt to speak to a child and see the world from a smaller height, and the difference between rock and flesh collapses into a single reliable instruction. Keep going, keep going, keep going. Far, far away, beyond deserts that smell of salt baked into rock, beyond streets where merchants call out prices that rise and fall with the angle of the sun. A young queen learned how heavy it is to carry anger for so long it becomes indistinguishable from purpose. Dragons are old stories given muscle and fire. Rule is a new story one must write while readers throw knives at the page. When her winds blew in the direction of the north, they bent trees and lives as all great winds do, and men in the gods would listen only more carefully, their hands on bark, their breath slow. Not from disdain or ignorance, but because the wisdom of the oldest things in the world is to remain what they are in the face of weather. The North has always done this. The North is to the realm what a tree's heartwood is to its trunk. And so the seasons did what seasons do. They came, they dressed the land, they undressed it. Children who had never known the man learned his habits by living inside the house he kept. They learned to pour their own water first and then ask whether anyone else was thirsty. They learned that cruelty is a lazy man's shortcut and that patience is not the same as weakness. They learned to stand straight when a banner was raised and to bow their heads when the old prayers were said, not out of superstition but because discipline is a way of cleaning the mind. The weirwood watched and in its fashion approved, which is to say it did not die and it sustained 1,000 birds with its berries and 1,000 looks with its shade. Some nights in Winterfell are so quiet that a person awake can hear snow forming, can actually hear the soft negotiation of flake with flake as the eaves fill. On such nights, when fires burn down to their most honest red and a dog breathes in the rhythm of a kind of dream only dogs know, one might take ink they hear footsteps in the corridor and then remember that all footsteps are overlaid with those that came before. It is not a ghost walking. It is the house rehearsing the memory of a man who always made his rounds. He would stop in life at the guardroom and look in without a word. He would stand beneath the arch of the inner gate and feel with his palm the seam where frost sometimes pried stone apart. He would check the latch on the side door of the buttery and smile to himself when he found it secured. He is not there to do those things, and yet they are still done. This is what inheritance means when it is most real. Not a sword or a title or a chest, but the continuation of useful habits in those who watched and learned. Sometimes a raven arrives in weather that seems to forbid flight and lands in a manner that looks almost like a fall and shakes itself and delivers its small letter of the world. The words inside are seldom comfortable. They seldom are. Even in peace there are taxes to be argued, boundary stones to be reset, feuds to be unwound thread by thread. Even in war there is bread to distribute and earth to break open for the dead. The hands that do such work now are not the hands that first taught the house how to do it. They are the hands of children grown and friends grown older. In their way, the work is the same. The ledger never closes. The ledger is the life. Now and then, in the market at the foot of the stronghold, a woman will sell little wooden wolves that she carved from last year's wind-thrown limbs. They are not handsome. They are honest. A little boy will tug a sleeve and point and be given one and spend the afternoon running in and out of legs and laughing with the wolf in his fist. He will play like that until the light very gently tells him to stop and then, as children do, he will sleep the instant his cheek finds the straw pillow. His mother will sit on the bed a moment and watch him and think of the time she laughed with a friend long ago at a feast when the roast was late and the minstrels were early, and there will be a sweetness in the air that has nothing to do with bread. In that sweetness the name of the old lord will be thought but not said, like a graceful, unneeded benediction. A life ends in one place and goes on in 100 others. The boy who chose the wall turned into the man the wall had been waiting for, and he made a series of decisions that many around him misunderstood until they saw the larger circle they described. He did what his father would have done, and also what his father would not have been permitted to do by the calendars and politics of his own time. There is honor in obeying a rule. There is also honor in remaking a rule so that it can live alongside the living. He stood at snowy parapets and thought of a courtyard stone warmed by summer sun. He wrote letters that felt like taking apart something finely made and putting it together in a better way. When he erred toward mercy, and sometimes men punished him for that with the reflex of those who fear change because it makes them look at themselves. He bore it, died of it even, and came back to the work because the work was what the world required. At the end of certain long labors, there is no trumpet, only a deeper breath. The long night cracked. Dawn revealed what it always reveals. Not a clean new world, but the old one slightly altered by what has been endured. The living gathered their heads and counted them and made lists of what needed mending. Some looked at their enemies and saw, very unexpectedly, neighbors. Some looked at former neighbors and saw, more expectedly, the early hints of new quarrels. In Winterfell, a new flag drooped where frost had settled on it, and then wind lifted it and it found a posture. The gods would give shade. The kitchens laid out loaves to cool. Wolves moved like thoughts at the edge of the trees. In the city where it had ended for him, the throne reaped what it had sown, which is the nature of thrones. Men and women sat and stood and knelt and rose again. They threw their hearts and their cleverness at that seat and were made to learn the lesson that power is a poor host and a worse bedfellow. At intervals word came north of this or that change, and Northmen read those words as they read weather. Interesting, occasionally threatening, never as binding as what the sky over their own heads told them by noon. The house that had lost its lord by the cities did not look to the city for permission to be itself. It never had. When spring returned at last, not only as a rumor but as a smell, the smell of damp earth and sheep who have remembered how to be impatient. There were days in which Winterfell's walls threw back sunlight so cleanly that you could stand in it and feel the bones under your skin approve. New banners unfurled and stuck only once or twice before learning their graceful snap. The forge sang again, and the smith's apron grew its familiar burns and stains. Children learned to skate on the pond in winter and to swim in it in summer and to fall in love with both. In the corner of the practice yard, a new rack of practice swords stood ready, and young voices hooped inside and complained, and an armsmaster raised an eyebrow when they did, and the old rhythm resumed. Heft, swing, stance, breathe. A girl with quick eyes told a boy who loved stories that he should hold the blade as if it could hear him and would obey if he spoke clearly, and he laughed, and then he did as she said and found that his swing improved because attention, applied consistently, is its own kind of magic. There are days, too, when rain sups steadily at the roof and the river rises to its polite brink and no one wants to be outdoors if they can help it. On those days the tapestries feel warmer, the tables broader, the nap by the fire something close to sacred. Such days are when tales are told, not the grand ones with drums and dragons but small ones that flavor the big ones until they are fit to be eaten by ordinary people. Someone will recall the Winter Lord walking across the yard with a child in each hand, each child talking over the other without embarrassment. Someone will recall him bending awkwardly to accept a flower from a shy girl. A weed! The girl had supposed until he told her that in winter a green thing is more than a flower because it is a promise. Someone will recall the night he went out in a storm with a lantern to find a gate left open and returned with a half-frozen shepherd boy whose life, after that, consisted of sheep and seasons and a very quiet, very reliable happiness. These are the stories that remain because they are the stories people can use. This is how to behave when a stranger knocks in a blizzard. This is how to speak to a child. This is how to divide meat when it is scarce and still have friends at the end of the meal. If you were to walk out of the castle at dusk and go to the field where the old stones stand, men hears from a time when men thought the sky needed a ladder, you would find that the grass there always seems to be a little shorter, as if the place trims itself for company. Sit, and you might hear nothing dramatic, something like a slow human breath. It is only the wind. It is also a reminder that men and their houses are temporary arrangements of a very old story. The part that Eddard Stark played in that story is the part a good beam plays in a roof. Everyone forgets to admire it until a heavy snow comes and the roof holds. You go to bed, you sleep, you wake, your children wake, and you do not even think to be grateful for being dry. The beam does not mind. The satisfaction is in the holding. From beyond the far hills and the sea's wrinkled edge, travelers still bring tales and barter them for bread because a tale is a kind of coin that buys attention and warmth. Some tales make listeners lower their eyes. Some make listeners straighten their backs as if an invisible hand had tugged at a string tied to the top of their heads. When it is time for the telling to end, the teller will often put his palm down flat in the air, smoothing it as one smooths a sheet before sleep, and that is when someone older will say, "And do you remember the northern lord who kept his word even when it cracked him?" The room quiets as if waiting for snow. He is one you can hand to a child when the child asks how to be. The old one will say, "He is not a king, not a hero from a song. He is a housefather who did not mistake cruelty for strength. He is a pattern you can lay under what you are sewing, and if you keep the stitches in line with it, the garment will serve." It is not that the world becomes gentle because such men lived. The world remains the world and shows its teeth as often as its smile. But a pattern, once learned, finds its way into other hands, into a sister who smiles and smiles at serpents until they reveal themselves, into a sister who moves without sound and offers justice the size of a needle, into a son who understands that borders extend past walls and vows past ink, into grandchildren who grow up thinking it natural that the person with the most power is the person with the most responsibility to speak last and listen longest. In that sense, Eddard Stark did not simply belong to Winterfell. Winterfell belonged to him the way a tree belongs to the ground that feeds it and the ground belongs to the weather that makes it honest. House and man, land and vow, blade and hand, paired things useful and true. Once, years after the worst of the wars had been filed away in the brain's cabinet marked necessary damage, a certain traveler came north to see the snow he had heard of in songs. He crossed the threshold and took off his hat and bowed more deeply than northerners usually like, and he said, awkward with the weight of rehearsed words, that he had known the Lord long ago as a boy and owed him more than could be said, and he had come to place his thanks where the man had placed his life. They took him down into the quiet where stone lies in rows like careful farming. He laid 2 fingers against the carved cheek and then drew back as if the stone had been too warm, and when he went away he walked as if he had traded some of his weight to the floor and the floor had accepted it. Such pilgrimages occur. They are not advertised. They do not change the world. They keep the world from becoming something else. And when the sky turns that particular iron color that makes fathers call their sons inside and mothers sweep the step twice, when the flurries begin that become the blizzard that becomes the clean page for another chapter of the North's long book, the house closes in around its fire the way a hand folds around a cup. The wind complains softly at the eaves. The dogs rearrange themselves. A door, not quite latched, taps until someone remembers and secures it. In the last moments before sleep, when the mind washes itself with images of places it trusts, what rises is often a corridor in Winterfell and a man walking it, his palm briefly greasing the cold stone where generations of palms have polished a faint oval into permanence. He pauses at the arch. He listens. He does not expect thanks. He moves on. Stone holds the day's warmth longer than flesh and the night's cool longer than the day. The house knows this and the man knew it, and those who learned by watching him keep knowing it even when the snow is too much, even when the letters are too many, even when the world seems tilted and the soup thin. In that keeping there is a promise, not the kind made with flourish and a seal but the kind that remakes a life one small action at a time. It is a promise worth sleeping under, steady as a roof beam, quiet as an ember, durable as the old words the North uses when the wind is up and the flue moans and the children are already drowsing. Keep faith, keep watch, keep warm, keep going.